Boker Tov, good morning to all of you. It's very hard to introduce somebody that you don't know. Did you ever try that? Well, there's a wonderful book. I decided that one way to get to know Amir is by looking through his book. That's not called reading, I know. I didn't read the book yet. I will. And one of the most interesting things were for me holding this book and looking through it that I started to know Amir. And let me share with you a few things I learned about Amir. For example, he says about himself, I am a Western Muslim. For readers who think this is an oxymoron, I hope this book will gently disabuse them of the notion that Muslims cannot be Western. That's interesting, especially for a person like me that walks around Israel and saying to people, I am a secular rabbi, and they look at me and say, isn't that an oxymoron? The other thing I read and I wanted to share with you was that he says, we cannot escape our history. Our only options are to blindly repeat it or to create new future by taking responsibility for understanding and building healthy relationships with those of whom we share this planet. I hope that this morning will be as positive, as hopeful. I think it's about time. When you look in the pamphlets that you all have, there is a short biography. So I won't repeat all of it because it is there, and I thought, like everything else that was done here in the colloquium was done very well. I would probably hope for a better picture. You saw it's a bit pixelized, but that's because Amir is also familiar and loves art, so I guess this is very artistic. But what you don't have written, I will read to you. Amir has a deep commitment to students and holds the distinction of being the only male to serve as Dean of Women at University College, University of Toronto. Before coming to California in 1997, Amir taught courses in religious studies at several universities in Canada. He is active in academic groups such as the American Academy for Religion, where he is co-chair of the Religion, Film, and Visual Culture groups, and serves on the steering committee of the Study of Islam section, and the Canadian Society for the Study of Religion. He is on the editorial boards of 2 scholarly journals, Contemporary Islam, Dynamics of Muslim Life, and Comparative Islamic Studies. Amir is also interested in areas such as religion and music, religion and literature, religion and film, and religion and popular culture. So please do read in your pamphlets because it is very interesting to know the academic background as well as a little bit about the person. So Amir, with that, we welcome you and are very happy that you came here.
Good morning. Is this loud enough? Thank you, Rabbi Sivan, for that wonderful introduction. Let me just start with a few words, as I think all of us have done, in memory of Sherwin Wine. I never had the privilege of meeting Rabbi Wine in person. We talked over the phone and over email about my participation in this colloquium, and got to know him just a little bit. I mean, I'd known about him from other people, but to actually get in touch with him was great, and I was really looking forward to meeting him, which of course isn't possible. And in thinking about him, it reminded me of a line when that happens in class, I just stop and wait. So, reminded me of a line from one of my great heroes, our sister Maya Angelou, a wonderful, wonderful poet. When a number of her friends passed away, 4 of them in particular, she wrote this incredibly moving piece. And it ends with the lines, they existed. They existed. We can be and be better because they existed. And that, for me, sums up Sherwin Wine. That we can be better because of people like him. I am a Muslim. In that sense, I'm anomalous, not because I'm a Muslim in a room full of people who aren't Muslim, but as a theist, as a religious person, if you'll forgive me as a believer. Let me apologize in advance for my language. I know I will use words that will be offensive to you, 4-letter words, which both in Hebrew and Arabic represent the name of God. I'll use those kinds of profanities, God, the divine. Have to be true to who I am, sorry. I'm a Canadian Muslim born in Pakistan who teaches theology at a Jesuit university in Los Angeles. So, do I contradict myself? Very well, I contradict myself, as a great American once said. I don't divide the world, though, into those simple dichotomies. I tell my students that. As a Canadian, I don't divide the world into Canadians and Americans. I don't divide the world into brown people and rich people. Brown people and white people. It's rich people and poor people. That's it for me. I mean, I betrayed it right there. To me, that's the dichotomy. Rich people, poor people. I come from a long line of poor people. That's where I put my sympathies. I offer here a Muslim response. It's, of course, not the Muslim response, but a Muslim response. We know about the diversity within our own traditions. When I teach my courses on world religions, one of the things that I start with is, if you're going to learn one thing in this class, it's that there's no one way to be anything. The diversity within a tradition is often much greater than between two or more traditions. And you know that from the Jewish tradition. Very small number. Professor Bauer was talking about this the other day. 13 million Jews in the world. And yet the differences, ethnically between Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews. Living in Los Angeles for 10 years, the Mizrahi Jews who tell me very clearly they are not Sephardic Jews, but are Mizrahi Jews. The doctrinal things. Secular Jews, Reform Jews, Reconstructionist Jews, Orthodox Jews, Jews who are Zionists, Jews who aren't Zionists, Jews who have a deep interest in mystical traditions, Jews who have no interest in mystical traditions, Jews who are on the left politically, Jews who are on the right politically. We know all those differences in a very small community. Worldwide, 1.2, 1.3 billion Muslims. So that diversity is there among us in the Muslim world. And so if I leave you with one thing, it's that. If we look at Indonesia as the country with the most Muslims, as Pakistan, probably the next country, as India or Bangladesh, depending on who you look at, half the Muslims in the world are in those 4 countries: Indonesia, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh. As someone who was born in Pakistan, I represent a more normative face, if you will, to Islam. It's an Asian face. It's a South Asian face. It's not so much an Arab face. Only 20%, as we've heard, of Muslims are Arabs. Lots of interesting connections between Jews and Muslims, between Islam and Judaism. Some horrible things, of course, and we've heard many of those things, and I think it's important for those of us, speaking as a Muslim, who are Muslim, to take responsibility for that and to understand the past, as someone also great once said about the need to not relive the past, but to learn from the past. This year marked this interesting coincidence where Rosh Hashanah and the month of Ramadan started at the same time. Muslims and Jews both use lunar calendar, with the difference, as was mentioned the other day, that Jews synchronize the solar calendar with the lunar calendar via that extra month of first Adar, that's occasionally added to the calendar. We as Muslims don't do that. And so it's coincidental, but I think auspicious, that you have these holidays happening together. And this year, as with last year, was able to have this wonderful privilege of fasting, during the month of fasting, on a day in which Jews were fasting for Yom Kippur and breaking the fast together as Muslims and Jews who happen to be fasting on the same day and breaking that fast together. That's one of the things that, for me, is important about the kind of work that I do with interfaith dialogue. Not that we try to convert each other. We've had histories, particularly as Muslims, of trying to do that. But that we try to help each other find what is meaningful in our own traditions. That, for me, is the key. I teach, as I said, at Loyola Marymount University, which is a Catholic Jesuit university. One of my colleagues there is Reverend Jim Fredericks, who, if you were to call up Central Casting and ask for a white guy, they'd send you Jim. He's pink, he's not white. He's got white hair, his father Fredericks, parish priest. He also happens to have a PhD from the University of Chicago in the history of religion, focusing on Buddhism, and speaks fluent Japanese to his parishioners in Little Tokyo. So interesting contradictions there. But Jim Fredericks brings me in, along with some of his Buddhist friends, into his classes on Catholic theology, systematic theology. Because, of course, for Catholics, as for other Christians, fasting, deeply rooted in the Jewish tradition, is an integral part of their tradition. Except for most Catholics today, particularly our students, it's not really a practice that they follow. Giving up chocolate for Lent is not the same thing as fasting, as much as it may be a hardship to some of our students. And so to bring in a Muslim or a Buddhist who fast, to help Catholics understand more about fasting in their traditions, is crucial. Rabbi Sivan mentioned the music. I love music. That's one of the things that interests me the most. And all sorts of diversity in Jewish music. If you're talking about the ritual music of the shofar, that's blown to mark the beginning of those holidays. And listening with great interest to Scott Marcus, who teaches at UC Santa Barbara and directs the Middle East Studies Ensemble there. And Scott is a wonderful player of benai, the reed flute that comes from Egypt. And he's talked about those connections, between the shofar and the flute, that they call us, apologies for these terms as religious people, back to remembrance of the divine, back to reflection, back to repentance. And without the breath of the musician, these are just simply empty vessels. It's the musician who breathes into them, who gives them life, who animates these things. This was one of the themes of one of my beloved heroes, Jalaluddin Rumi, the great Persian poet, whose 800th birthday we're celebrating this year. And Rumi talks about the flute and the divine breath that brings the music. And he talks about the flute being plucked from the reed bed and blowing this song of lament of being back in the garden from which it came. Those of you that know another great Canadian, Joni Mitchell, know that song that she wrote for Woodstock. And that's where that theme comes from. We've got to get ourselves back to the garden. That whole sense of not just Garden of Eden kinds of things, but Rumi's lines about the reed garden from which we come. All sorts of similarities, I think, between Jews and Muslims. And I just want to focus on a few of them in terms of the theme, a Muslim response, what can be done. The first thing is the love of learning, I think that we share. As a child, I came to Canada, to Toronto, with my parents in 1970. We were part of that first wave of new South Asian Muslim immigrants to Canada. At that point, in 1970, there were no more than 30,000 Muslims in the entire country. Now, there are over 600,000 Muslims in Canada, making Islam the second largest religion in the country. When I was young, I didn't actually have any Muslim friends until I came probably to university. I mean, there were two other Muslim kids in my high school, but it really wasn't until university that I got to be, more involved with Muslim students. And so my first friends, the first formative friends I had, were Christian and Jewish friends. So learning from my friends, learning particularly from my teachers, in part my Jewish teachers, who taught me to value learning. So that's one connection that we share. Another one is the idea of social justice. North American Jews have been at the forefront of many of the progressive struggles in the history of this country, in Canada. From them, from you, I've learned not just to stand for yourself, but to stand for other people, to do the right thing, which may not be the right thing, the best thing for you, but it's the best thing for everyone concerned. And this echoes for me a very important Muslim principle, a line from the Quran. This is chapter 4, verse 135. O you who believe, stand out firmly for justice as witnesses to God, even as against yourselves or your parents or your kin, and whether it be against rich or poor, for God can best protect both. Follow not the desires of your own hearts, lest you swerve, and if you distort justice or decline to do justice, truly God is well acquainted with all that you do. Yeah. I love that line. Stand firmly for justice even against yourselves or your parents or your kin. Do the right thing, because doing the right thing is what's important. A third theme that I see is very crucial that connects Muslims and Jews is that notion of exile. Professor Penslar talked about that the other day, the notion of galut, the theme that runs through Jewish tradition. I'm a Canadian who's made a conscious choice to live in the United States. Technically, of course, that makes me an emigre, not an exile. But as an emigre, as a Canadian of South Asian background, what Americans call a person of color, as a scholar whose calling is to find words for complex identities, what Americans call an intellectual, and now especially as a Muslim in America, 6 years after the horrible terrorist attacks of 9/11, the metaphor of exile deepens my compassion, clarifies my work. One of my great Christian teachers from the Middle East wrote this about the condition of exile, and he said, most people are principally aware of one culture, one setting, one home. Exiles are aware of at least two. And this plurality of vision gives rise to an awareness of simultaneous dimensions, an awareness that, to borrow a phrase from music, is contrapuntal. And perhaps this is the best descriptor for those of us who are members of minority communities, religious or otherwise. We live contrapuntal lives. We, as North American Muslims, have much to learn from North American Jews. You have a very long history in this country. Ours as Muslims is just as long if you talk about when we first got here. Our best estimates are that about 20% of the West Africans brought over in the slave trade were Muslim, some of whom retained their Muslim identity. But in numbers, we've only been here in the U.S. since 1965. In 1965, you had changes to immigration laws with the civil rights law. And so we're this community that in its history goes back hundreds of years. In numbers, both in Canada, and Canada happened a few years later, but around the same time. We've only been here in numbers for about 40 years. We're a much younger community in terms of our community life than you are. We're really beginning that second stage of community development as Muslims in North America. The first stage was developing places of worship. When I first came with my parents in 1970, there was one mosque in Toronto that had been built 2 years before. It actually hadn't been built. It was a Presbyterian church that was sold and bought by the Muslim community and redone as a mosque. When I left in 1997, there were 35 mosques in Toronto. And so that first phase, building places of prayer. But the second phase, social service institutions, those are fairly new. The Islamic Social Services Resource Association in Canada dates from 1992. Yeah. As immigrants, oftentimes we had that immigrant mindset, mentality. We want to fit in. There's nothing wrong with our communities. All the problems that you have in your communities, we of course don't have there. We don't need to have a shelter for battered women because of course no Muslim would ever hit his wife. We don't need to have things to feed the hungry because of course no Muslim would let another Muslim go hungry. We don't need to have institutions for the elderly because heaven forbid that a Muslim would let his parents live in an old folks home. No, we take care of the people in our community. And of course you realize we've got all those same problems. What do you do with the very serious issues around familial violence, particularly violence towards women, with hunger? What do you do with that generation that's getting older? And so we're at that second stage, creating those social service agencies. We need your help in that because you have that history that we don't. And Muslims very consciously are looking to Jewish communities and Catholic communities. If you look at America, it's very much a Protestant country in terms of numbers. California is different because California, in lots of ways, is different. Religiously is different because California is more Catholic than Protestant. And yet, if you were to tell people, the Jamestown colony, that there would be in 2001 26 Jesuit universities in the States, you're crazy. No way that's going to happen. How do you create those institutions? Catholic universities, Jewish universities, centers of medicine. We have lots of Muslim doctors. We don't have anything like the equivalent of Cedars-Sinai. We're starting to build those kinds of institutions here in the U.S. For many of us, speaking again as Muslims, particularly as younger Muslims, there's a connection with our Jewish friends that simply isn't there for our parents' generations. And not because they were anti-Semitic in any kind of overt or systematic way. It's just if you grow up without knowing people in the Jewish community, you could perhaps be more likely to think negatively of them in a way that if you're encountering them, as I did, with friends, with teachers, it's a very different understanding. Having been to Israel twice, the first time I mentioned the other day in 1988, I think for many of my Muslim friends, it's not the same issue as it is for other Muslims, particularly some Arab Muslims, about issues of existence of Israel, those kinds of questions. That's not a question for us. For us, it's not that Israel should or shouldn't exist. Israel, of course, exists. Israel is reality. It becomes an issue of how is it that people behave. So it's a very different sort of question there. Not at all denying the right of the state of Israel to exist, not at all denying that Zionist project, valuing our Jewish friends, which I think is very different. There's also a generation of us that are starting to come through as North American Muslims who are articulating our own understandings of what it means to be a Muslim in this setting, in a setting that is a minority for us. I was born in Pakistan. But since I was 4, I've lived in Canada. And then for the last 10 years in the US. I've always been a Muslim in a minority setting, which changes the discourse. Again, those connections with the Jewish community of being a minority. Not the majority where you can dictate the discourse, but a minority. As someone living in the West, in dealing with all sorts of issues that are issues here that may not be issues in the same way in parts of the Muslim world. Certain Muslim countries, homosexuality is a criminal offense. I remember being on a panel when the New Democrat Party in Ontario, the Bob Rae's government, brought in same-sex spousal benefits. Those kinds of things just simply wouldn't happen. What do you do in California, where the state policy is same-sex spousal benefits? How do you articulate your connections there? And also, as people who are from different traditions. Speaking in the United States, about a quarter of us as Muslims are African Americans. About a third of us are South Asian. About a third of us are Middle Eastern, and Middle Eastern means lots of things. Iranian Muslims are very different from Egyptian Muslims. And so you come to a place where A, you're in the minority, B, you're dealing with issues that you may not have to deal with in your countries of origin, C, you're a multi-ethnic and I would say even multi-religious community, Sunnis and Shias. Shias make up 10 to 15% of the Muslim world. In North America, they make up about 30% because of immigration from countries. Those of us that live in Los Angeles know the huge Iranian populations. And of course, not all Iranians in any way are Muslim. You've got, important Jewish communities, the Baha'i communities, secularists. But the Muslims, of course, are Shia Muslims from Iran. And many of us, as Muslim scholars, are trying to be reflexive, self-critical, but also within the Muslim tradition. One of the books that I had the great privilege of being involved with, in just a tangential way of contributing a chapter, is a book called Progressive Muslims on Justice, Gender, and Pluralism is the title. Omid Safi, SAFI, was the editor. He's at University of North Carolina. And this book came out in 2003, just simply Progressive Muslims is the title. And it was in response to what we heard post 9/11, where are the voices of moderate Muslims, where are the voices of progressive Muslims? And those of us that were working in the academy realized that our voices weren't being put out there in the mainstream, whether the mainstream non-Muslim community or the mainstream Muslim communities. We were talking essentially to ourselves, about these kinds of ideas, which I think is very important. I mean, I happen to teach in a university setting. That's an important thing to do, the conversation among academics. And yet, for so many of us, what we needed to do was put our voices out there in the mainstream. And so we put together this volume that Omid edited. The subtitle is On Justice, Gender, and Pluralism. And there's 15 chapters in the book, 5 of them on each. And so there are incredible resources here. We're talking here in North America. Amina Wadud at Virginia Commonwealth University, who writes on gender issues. Or Keisha Ali at Boston University. Or Gwendolyn Simmons at the University of Florida, or Ibrahim Musa at Duke University, or Amit Kara Mustafa at Washington University in St. Louis. There are all sorts of Muslim voices, which unfortunately get ignored by the mainstream media, as if we're not dealing with those kinds of issues in our community. The last book that I wrote, Oil and Water, was meant to be an introduction to Islam for a North American Christian audience, but my hope was that it would be read in some ways backwards by Muslims. In the last decade, my work has been trying to talk about Islam primarily to non-Muslim audiences. In the last couple of years, I've discovered a need to go back to Muslim audiences, because some of the things that I hear, some of the conservatism that I hear, the ahistorical sorts of readings of the Quran, become quite problematic for me as a Muslim. And so it's important for me to work within my own community. And there are many of us who are doing that. Professor Malkin talked about Israelis learning from the diaspora, in his remarks on Friday night. And that's an interesting connection as well. We as Muslims here in North America are creating our own authentic forms of Islam. Some of the work that we're doing here, going back to influence countries of origin. I talked about this with some of you the other day, that in Canada, you had about 27 years ago now, the creation of the Canadian Council of Muslim Women. These were Canadian Muslim women who, of course, interacting with other women, particularly Jewish and Christian women, realized that they didn't have the same kinds of resources that their Jewish and Christian sisters did, of organizations for Jewish women or Christian women. And so they put together this group, the Canadian Council of Muslim Women. What you saw a couple of years ago were women in Egypt saying, wait a minute, how come these Canadian Muslim women have an organization for Canadian Muslim women, and we don't have an organization for Egyptian Muslim women? So in interesting kinds of ways. We're a very small community. I've seen numbers in America for Muslims as low as 2.5 million, which I think is way too low. I've seen numbers as high as 10 million, which I think is way too high. My own sense is about 7 million. And so it's not a huge community in terms of numbers, but it's starting to grow in terms of its influence. the 900-pound gorilla in the room in America isn't American imperialism in the sense of military issues or economic, certainly not these days where the Canadian dollar is versus the American dollar. It's American culture. That's exported around the world. As a Canadian kid, I grew up watching American television. It was a delight last night at the hotel to be able to turn on the CBC and watch Hockey Night in Canada, which for many of us is a religious experience. You're seeing on the CBC thank you. You're seeing on the CBC, Zarka Nawaz's program, Little Mosque on the Prairie, which has become a great hit. You're seeing, for those that aren't familiar with it, it's a great show. And Zarka is this Torontonian Muslim woman who got married, moved out with her husband to Regina, Saskatchewan, lives on the prairie, raised a family of 4 kids, and is a Muslim woman filmmaker. I would encourage you, I mentioned this to some of you, a film she did a couple of years ago for the National Film Board of Canada called Me and the Mosque, with her own struggles as a Muslim woman, where the mosque that she knew as a space where women were welcome had become this space where women were almost entirely shut out. And so she did this documentary. And so those are the kinds of voices that I'm talking about, Muslim women who are very seriously looking at the issues that affect not just them, but Muslims in North America. And then she was able to, through a production deal with the CBC, do this sitcom, Little Mosque on the Prairie, which reflects some of the realities of Muslim life in America. You have Aliens in America, the show on the CW that just started about a month ago, which I think is really brilliant to say, well, here are some of the realities of American Muslim life. There are all sorts of initiatives that Muslims and Jews are doing. I am, as I mentioned, from Los Angeles. So let me take a minute or two to talk about, well, me. I've done work at Temple Bethel, a Reform temple in San Pedro. 2001, I was invited there, I think with some trepidation on the part of their members, but with courage to say, well, we need to hear from Muslims. Now, when I go back, and I've been working with them every year, you're welcomed almost as a son, as part of that community. Having done work with Jim Kaufman at Valley Beth Hillel, or Ed Feinstein at Valley Beth Shalom, or Michael Barkley, who's at LMU now, who's the rabbi at LMU, which shows what a wonderful place we are, that not only do we have a Jewish studies program that's starting, but we've got a rabbi who's there. Don't mean to out Paul Waller, but working with Paul and his wife Joan on very interesting initiatives that take place there. So sometimes you don't hear about those kinds of things, the meetings that we've had in Paul and Joan's home. Formal things. Muslim Public Affairs Council and the Progressive Jewish Alliance have done an initiative called New Ground. I've done work with the American Jewish Committee on some really interesting kinds of projects. One over the summer, a huge one around Darfur, done at the First AME Church, one of the key African-American churches in Los Angeles, to say, here are people who have a very real experience of slavery. And what are the concerns there? Whether you're African-Americans who've been enslaved in this land, or Jews who were enslaved in Babylon 2,500 years ago, or Muslims who unfortunately are involved in that now, but to come together to deal with some of those issues. The secular religious issue becomes an interesting one. When we talk about secular, what do we mean? In North America, all the studies that I've read show that North Americans are much more religious than Europeans, for example, if you measure it in terms of belief in God, reading the Bible, praying, those kinds of things. So when we say North America secular, we don't mean it's not religious. We mean that there's no official state religion. Because the president is a Methodist, that doesn't mean that the Methodist Church is given pride of place. Very different in Europe. And the European term, the French European term, laïcité, really means something very different. One of the great books that I would recommend to you, one of the great authors who looks at Islam in Europe, is a French scholar, Olivier Roy. And I was actually given his last book in French from Columbia University Press, who's published some of these things, to see if they should translate it. And it was a great opportunity for me to sort of keep my French chops up. And the book in French is called La laïcité face l'Islam, laïcité facing Islam. And they translated it with the wrong title. They translated it as Secularism Confronts Islam. And you want to say that's not the case, because in Europe, particularly in France, it's a disestablishment of religion. It's a very different kind of thing. Here in America, it's non-establishment. In Europe, particularly in France, it's disestablishment. Very different kinds of things. And so when Muslims hear, as religious people, about secular, they tend to think of that disestablishment. That's not what we're talking about. Do we engage with people in the Muslim world as Muslims? One of my great, great heroes in Los Angeles, a brilliant scholar, Jack Miles. Jack's first book was God, a Biography. Brilliant, brilliant book, where Jack looks at, and he's one of those people that's, hugely overeducated, studies as a Jesuit, left before ordination, so, he's fluent in Latin and Greek, then did a degree at Harvard in Near Eastern languages, so knows Hebrew and Arabic. So he's one of those people that can, read the Bible in Hebrew and read the New Testament in Greek and read the Quran in Arabic. Between the two of us, we have a Pulitzer Prize and a MacArthur Genius Grant. He's got both, but he lets me hold them every now and then. But Jack's book, and all of us who write hate Jack for this reason, because when your first book wins a Pulitzer Prize and your second book wins a National Book Award, it becomes a little annoying for the rest of us. But this book, God, a Biography, is brilliant, because let's look at God as a literary character in the Bible. Let's look at the development of God as a character. And Jack's involved with the Pacific Council on International Policy, which is sort of the West Coast arm of the Council on Foreign Relations. He's been doing some interesting work that I've been privileged to help him with on engaging with Muslims as Muslims. Because when we do all sorts of initiatives with people in the Muslim world, except it's with economists, it's with bankers, it's with politicians. It's not with religious people as religious people. And so, how do you start to do those kinds of dialogues? That becomes so important, I think. How do we understand, our traditions? How do we rethink those traditions? How do we reshape them? And we are doing that, And it's there. How do you reinterpret text? That was the key thing yesterday. How do you make sense of what's there in the text, which may be problematic, but as a believer, you can't just simply say, okay, let's cross that out. You can't eliminate that. How do you understand it? But there's all sorts of texts within the Quran, even, that talk about the self-critical thing that we need to have as Muslims. My favorite little chapter, one of the chapters towards the end, chapter 107 of the Quran, the small kindness. It's not a well-known chapter, and yet, to me, it's that admonishment. It begins, the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful, as all the chapters but one of the Quran do. Have you seen the one who calls the day of judgment a lie? That is the one who treats the orphan harshly, who does not encourage the feeding of the needy. Woe to those who pray but are unmindful of their prayers, those who would be seen but refuse the small kindness. To me, that's a critical rebuke there. If you believe in this, then what do? You treat the orphan properly. You feed the needy. You're kind to people. It's the behavior that's important. And that becomes crucial for me as a Muslim. Some of you may be familiar with a document that came out last week called A Common Word, which is a document signed by 138 Muslim scholars, academics, religious leaders from around the world that was sent to Christian leaders, called A Common Word. And it's got some interesting responses. It was meant as Muslim-Christian dialogue, but it's got some interesting responses from the Jewish world. Peter Ox, who's got an endowed chair at the University of Virginia, talks about the connections there. For him as a believing Jew, the world rests on three things: justice, truth, peace. And here are Muslims talking about those same kinds of things. We have those connections. We have had those connections. And there have been horrible examples that we've heard, and there's no denying those or undermining those. There also have been good examples, and we tend not to focus on that. And I teach in university. I can't be anything but an optimist. You see these students who are wonderful. It's just amazing to see the look in their face. What's that?
You haven't taught long.
I haven't taught long. That's true. Yeah, they haven't had that ground out. You're right. I'm still young and keen in that kind of way. But for me, it's that thing of seeing these students who maybe I'm naive to think that they are going to change the world. And we see some amazing connections between us, talking now as Jews and Muslims. And I want to end just with a piece by one of my great literary heroes, Maria Menokal, who like Professor Gerber, also teaches about Spain. And Maria is the chair, was the chair of Spanish and Portuguese at Yale, directs the Whitney Humanities Center at Yale. And she writes about an interesting connection between Muslims and Jews. And this was based, something she wrote in 1992, where we were talking, of course, about the 500th anniversary of Columbus, but she was talking about a different event that took place in 1992. And so I'm just going to close with some lines from her. In the destruction of the whole of the magnificent National Library and other major collections in Sarajevo in 1992, it now appears one very significant book was rescued, the famous manuscript called the Sarajevo Haggadah. The Haggadah is, of course, a prayer book, that is, appropriately, the collection of prayers to be said on Passover, on the eve of Exodus. But despite its name, this gorgeous and elaborately illuminated manuscript, considered the best of its kind anywhere in the world and much treasured by Jews everywhere, is not Sarajevan at all, nor merely Jewish, but rather Spanish. And what can Spanish possibly mean? She puts that in scare quotes. What do I mean it to be that is so different from what it seems to be in most other uses of this and other identity tags? Made in Spain in the late 13th century, it is, to put it most reductively, one of the many reflections of a Jewish culture that flourished and had its golden age, precisely because it adopted the virtues of exile and found its distinctly impure voice within an Arabic culture that was expansive and promiscuous and often exilic itself. It is thus altogether fitting that the precious object, the book that inscribes the story of the exile from Egypt, was carried out of Spain by members of the exiled Sephardic community in 1492 and remained for the better part of the subsequent 500 years well protected and cherished inside the Ottoman Empire. Itself a remarkable example of the great good of empires, which learn how to absorb and tolerate and intermarry identities, and which became, after 1492, the place of refuge of most Sephardic Jews and of many Andalusian Muslims. But the manuscript had to be rescued once again during World War II, and it was when a Muslim curator in Sarajevo, attached as most Muslims are to the memory of Spain, saved that Spanish Haggadah from Nazi butchers. And she continues here, and I want to conclude with her words. Surely the morals of the story are perfectly clear. To understand the richness of our heritage, we must be the guardians of the Haggadah, the Muslim librarian who was not an Arab, of course, but who in saving the manuscript was fulfilling the best of the promises of Islamic Spain and Europe. And we must be the translators who reveal the exquisite ambivalence and sometimes painful conflict of identity of Judah Halavi, whose poetry is sung in so heavy an Arabic accent. And we must be the guardians and defenders of the interfaith marriages between the Christian girls who sang in corrupt romance and the refined poets of the Arab courts, which is left inscribed as a passionate and great love in the Muwashashat. We must, in other words, and I love her lines here, reject the falsehoods of nations in our work and reveal with the exquisite Ibn Arabi, a 13th century Muslim thinker, the virtues of what he more simply calls love. My heart can take on any form, he tells us. And then he simply names those temples at which he prays, the temples that inhabit him. An important list here: the gazelle's meadow, here for animists, the monk's cloister, the Torah, the Kaaba. These are things that Ibn Arabi names. These are the temples whose priests we need to be, Professor Menokal writes, if we are to understand what any of this history is about. And it is only in them that there can be any future understanding of the complex identity of Europe in the Middle Ages, and almost undoubtedly in its present and its future as well. Thank you.